Good evening. This is W2NDG on the Overlook Mountain Amateur Radio Club's 805 repeater. Let's pause for any emergency traffic. If you have emergency traffic, please come now. All right, nothing heard, which is always a good thing. Once again, this is Neil, W2NDG, on the OMARC Sunday Night Science and Technology Net. This net occurs every Sunday night at 8 p.m., usually co-hosted by myself and Jim, K2BHM. Jim has been away, and we wish him the best, hoping that he does get a chance to listen once in a while, but he'll be back with us, and I have an interesting series I'm going to start putting together that will talk more about radio. So I know he wants to be a part of that. So anyway, I'm getting comments already. We are also live on YouTube, like we usually are. The YouTube link, if you go to, basically go to YouTube, and if you search for OMARC, O-M-A-R-C, Science and Technology Net, or W2NDG, Science and Technology, you'll find our live stream. This is the Science and Technology Net number 10. And what we will do is I usually give an idea of what we're going to be talking about tonight, and a little bit of a monologue with some pauses. Then we'll take some check-ins and have some discussion. We don't have to stay on topic. If somebody has something interesting that applies to science and technology they'd like to discuss, they can suggest an alternative topic or a modification to the current topic, and we'll go in that direction. I'm kind of winging it tonight. I really had two topics that I wanted to cover, and I'm going to start with one of them and then suggest the other one. So let me drop. All right. I've got a few people on YouTube already. What I wanted to talk a bit about tonight was quantum technology. It's something that's been coming up in the news once in a while, and it's something that I really haven't understood fully either. But I have a basic understanding of what it means. And I've been doing a little bit of quick research tonight just to get an idea of how to get a more layperson's description. So what is quantum technology as applied to computing is pretty much where we've been hearing it come up lately. But it does encompass a much larger subject. So I'll drop. W2NDG on OMARC Sunday Night Science and Technology Net. So frequently when people discuss quantum mechanics, the story of Schrodinger's cat comes up. And Schrodinger's cat is not a physical experiment that somebody did. No animals were harmed in the thought experiment that Schrodinger's cat is. Basically, it's a way of explaining quantum superposition. And what it means is the thought experiment was, if you were to take a cat and seal that cat in a box with a radioactive source and a flask of poison that would release a poison gas when broken, seal the cat in the box, release the radiation, release the poison gas, but because the cat is sealed in the box, you are unable to observe anything that's going on in the box. You have confirmation, electrically, electronically, whatever, that the two actions you took, the release of the radiation and the breaking of the flask, did occur, but you cannot observe the condition of the cat. Quantum mechanics states that at that moment, the cat is both alive and dead. Let me drop. And the cat remains both alive and dead until it can be observed, at which point its quantum state changes. When it's in that state of flux where you cannot observe what is actually going on, that is referred to as superposition. And I can hit up some other notes that basically explain, actually, of all places, Forbes had a fantastic description. And I hate reading on the radio, but I'm going to do a little of that tonight. So let me drop and explain where Forbes puts it. Forbes states, when you enter the world of atomic and subatomic particles, things begin to behave in unexpected ways. In fact, the particles can exist in more than one state at a time, like our cat. It's this ability that quantum computers take advantage of. Instead of bits, which conventional computers use, a quantum computer uses quantum bits known as qubits. To illustrate the difference, imagine a sphere. A bit can be either of the two poles of the sphere. Let me pause the reading here just to say, when we talk about bits in standard computing, a bit is 1 or 0, on or off. It has two states, observable, and it is one or the other. It cannot be both. It cannot be neither. So computers are built basically on millions and millions and millions of tiny switches that are either on or off. And that is the basic building block of that. So when they're saying, if you look at a sphere, the only 2 points on a sphere that can be defined as 2 points would be the two poles of the sphere. A qubit, however, can exist at any point on the sphere. So it means that a computer using qubits can store an enormous amount of information and use less energy doing so than a classic computer. By entering into the quantum area of computing, where traditional laws of physics no longer apply, we'll be able to create processors that are significantly faster by 1 million or more times than the ones we use today. It sounds fantastic, but the challenge is that quantum computing is also incredibly complex. The pressure is on the computer industry to find ways to make computing more efficient. Since we reached the limits of energy efficiency using classical methods, by the year 2040, according to the report by the Semiconductor Industry Association, we will no longer have the capability to power all of the machines around the world. That's precisely why the computer industry is racing to make quantum computers work on a commercial scale. It's no small feat, but one that will pay amazing dividends. So it goes on to talk about how the predictions of what it feels quantum computing is going to do to the computing world. And one thing that they speculate, at least in our current future, the future that we're going to see ourselves, quantum computing will probably not replace standard computing. It will enhance it. It will take over the computations that standard computing can't really handle. One of the articles I saw when I was searching around for things, let me drop, spoke about the concept of big data. Now, in my day job, I deal with enormous amounts of data, and cancer research has become very computational and virtual. The idea of big data is sometimes also called non-relational databases. It's just the ability to take huge mountains of data that's not necessarily organized and make something of it. You're seeing technologies that use non-relational databases and artificial intelligence, AI, that are trying to make sense of this data. And it has already produced all sorts of fantastic results. But the problem is that as this data that we have grows, and just incredible amounts of data, we need more and more power to process it. And that's what they're saying. We're getting to a point where we can see the end of our own abilities. So interesting stuff. At least I found it to be. And, when you've been around since the dawn of computing, at least personal computing, it's even more interesting to watch how things have grown. So we can discuss the beginnings of computing as far as you saw it and where it's going. But quantum computing will affect our lives in our own lifetimes. Let me drop. Locally, this becomes important. And one of the reasons why is that IBM, one of the leaders in this, has chosen Poughkeepsie as their quantum computing center. So it's going to be an interesting local thing that a lot of the progress and discoveries that IBM makes along those lines may happen right here at home. So also, how does this affect radio? I want everybody to think about how computing affected radio. The fact that we can have these wonderful rigs that have basically a computer inside of them, allowing us to have standalone software-defined radio. Computer is doing the heavy lifting. Let me drop. The more powerful that computer, and the more we advance the ways of getting the radio spectrum into that computer, the more processing we can do at one time, the faster we can process, the better the filters become, the better the ability to get rid of interference or everything else. The computer algorithms for processing radio are getting better and better. And it's interesting to see where that goes. But I'll tell you one place it's going. Somebody has decided that these two technologies can work together. And they've come up with the concept. I don't think they've actually made the actual piece of hardware yet, but the concept of a quantum software-defined radio. So quantum software-defined radio, in the article that I read, seems to say that it would be able to sample the entire radio spectrum, or at least a huge portion of it, like 100 kilohertz to 5 gigahertz at one time, and then allow you to process that entire spectrum. So it's an interesting thought. I think we're probably a decade away from actually seeing a model of it, but it's possible. And it's possible to the point that it probably will happen. Let me drop. This is W2NDG on the OMARC Sunday Night Science and Technology Net. So I do like to relate some of the things that we talk about back to ham radio. It's not always possible, but computing does affect what we do. And even the engineering side of it, the ability to model things and come up with the computer technology that can analyze what we do. There's certain things. We had a networking specialist once explain to us that the reason why copper twisted pair technology had moved at the slow pace that it has, Cat5, Cat5e, Cat6, and the ability for copper wire to carry more and more information at a higher speed is because the computer models that existed for trying to figure out the parameters of how many twists per foot and other orientations of your 4 twisted pairs or 8 wires was so complex that it really couldn't be done by today's computers. There's therefore another thing that quantum computing might give us is the engineering side of things. And of course, if the computer is able to engineer something like that, why couldn't it answer some of the mysteries of antennas that we've never been able to completely unravel? So just relating it all back together. And we can talk tonight a little bit about where it started. And when you talk about computers and how they've evolved, think back to the first computer you ever used. Think back to the first device in your home that was really run by a computer chip. Think about storage. Think about the first computer that you had that had a hard drive in it and what the size of that hard drive is and how much storage you carry on your person when you walk out the door. Things like that. So we'll chat a little bit about that tonight, and maybe someone has some more information about quantum computing we can talk about, but that is where it's going. I did get a couple things that filtered in on YouTube here. Let me drop. Chris was asking about the theory about technology doubling. Does it have a finite limit, or just the means to get forward will change? Yes. It's a little of both. So any technology has a finite limit with what we currently know. The thing is, if you look at the history of technology and where it's gotten us, something else usually comes along. One of the scary things about technology is that the ability for the world to support a certain amount of population, as far as feeding that population and comfortably supporting that population, changed drastically with the discovery of petroleum and petroleum refining. We're still waiting for the next step in that. So we are fast approaching a point where the world with that level of technology is going to have trouble supporting population, because the type of technology we're talking about tonight isn't going to help with that so much. The computational ability will eventually, because it may lead to new technologies that could supplant our reliance on things like petroleum, like being able to engineer super efficient solar cells, or to refine the idea of supercapacitors for storage instead of batteries. There is a lot of technology that we're right on the edge of, and having more computing power will kind of tip us over that. So yeah, eventually Moore's law is going to peter out with our current technology, because you get to a point where you can't make the components of a chip smaller than the molecules that comprise them. But new technology will pick up where that technology ends. Let me drop. So let's take check-ins, see who's here tonight. And I know it's a couple people on YouTube, but you can throw your name or call sign up, and I'll throw you into the rotation. This is W2NDG on the OMARC Sunday Night Science and Technology Net. To check in, you're going to give me your call sign, your first name, and your location. Please come now.
This is November 2, Foxtrot Zulu Charlie Thomas. This is KUBAH Jimmy McKenzie. Here is KB2GGM Max in Kerhonkson. This is KB2TAT Siege and Count Poughkeepsie.
All right. And we do have a number of people watching, but Chris checked in. That's W2CRW. So anybody on YouTube, if I do come up to you and ask a question, you can type it into the chat. But if you are unable to, that's fine. Chris says he is in his basement, here but not rotating. Well, rotational ability does also speak of quantum technology in a way, but we won't get into that. All right. We have our check-ins. Let me just drop and see if there's anybody else who wants to check in tonight, and then we'll start by asking some questions. So anybody else want to go ahead?
KB2 UES, Bella Rules for Park.
All right. Good evening, Bill. We'll take more check-ins later on. All right. So when we think back to where all of this has come from and where it's going, we start trivializing a lot, but we kind of forget where it's come from. So I'm going to ask each of you to tell me, what is the first computer that you saw, possibly used, and what's the first computer that you owned? And I'm going to take some notes and we'll go from there. So, Tom from Fishkill, what's the first computer you remember ever seeing and the first computer that you owned?
Well, in college, you have the mainframe, and I remember, not that I did much of it, but people with the punch cards and the terminal and feed them in. That's probably the first one that I didn't really interact with, but I saw. The first computer I owned was a TRS-80, which fascinated me at the time. Black and white, text, but basic. Spent a lot of time, playing with basic, and then saving it on cassette tapes and loading it from cassette tapes, which was a pain because if you didn't get a really high quality cassette tape, there would be a dropout. You'd lose your program. That's it. It's amazing to think how far we've come since. Thanks for having me. See you back to that.
Well, cool stuff. And I can tell you that, the first computer I ever saw or witnessed, I can say similar experience to yours. I was in elementary school, and we were taken on a tour of IBM and got to see one of the mainframes in operation. And they let each of us sit down in the terminal and told us things that we could ask the computer, that it would understand certain questions. And that was, I'm not sure what the mainframe would have been at that point, but that would have been around 1972, 1973, probably. So, but cool stuff. I'll get to more of my computer history as we run through the list. We also had Brad check in, KC2VVJ, through YouTube. And I'll get to Brad's comments when we get through everybody else in the rotation. So Jim, KD2VAH, first computer you remember seeing or using, first computer you owned.
First one I owned, Handy HX, I believe it was. And I remember that year we got a tax refund back, and I told the wife, I said, well, we can get a VCR, or we can get a computer. She's like, we don't need no VCR, go get one of those computer things. Because nobody knew about them back then, really. I mean, you heard about them, but nobody had one at home. And I believe I already told this story, but I ended up doing like I always do. I wired up the whole house with the thing. Speakers, alarms, humidity, light detectors. Once I found out a serial port was basically a whole bunch of on and off switches that were being monitored. And I do remember the cassette tape, because I remember my first disk drive, floppy disk drive, cost me $250. A lot of money in those days. 1987, maybe 7.5, maybe a little later. Not much though.
Oh, cool stuff. Um, There can be a lot of Tandies mentioned, I'm sure. And whereas, yeah, the first computer I ever witnessed or saw was in the elementary school, trip to IBM. The first computer I ever saw at somebody's house was a TRS-80 Model 1. A lot of my friends were, their fathers were IBMers. It was that neighborhood. Xena was, a huge percentage of IBM employees living in Xena. And IBM didn't have a personal computer when the TRS-80s came out. So that's what they all bought. And I got a couple of books about how to write programs for them. And I used to go over to my friend's house and punch in, simple programs, just spelled out my name or repeated it in patterns on the screen. And, but it was a start, and it got me involved. So that's probably the second step in my computer exposure. All right. Well, thanks, Jim. And oh, good. We're getting some more stuff on YouTube, comment-wise. All right. KB2GGF, Matt Kerhonkson. What's the first computer you were exposed to, and what's the first one you owned?
Good evening, Neil. First computer I was exposed to was in high school around 1975 or 76, and it was, I really don't remember the model, but it was an IBM mainframe style computer. It used the do not fold, bend, or fold, spindle, bend, spindle, and mutilate. I forget the phrase, but don't do any of those things to the cards. Use the IBM punch cards. And there was also another computer they had which used a perforated paper tape for programming information. Never got too involved with those. First computer I owned that I saw in someone's house was an Apple I at a friend of a friend's house, and his older brother had bought it, and I bet he wishes he still had it. Let me drop. Okay, back again. And the first computer that I owned myself was a Timex Sinclair ZX1, which was very limited, but it was the first one I got. And I sort of stalled there, and I didn't get another computer until I got a 386 with Windows, I think it was 3.1. So quite a few years between that and that. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. KB2 GGF.
The Timex Sinclair. So, yeah, Sinclair came up with the original model, the ZX80, which was a kit, as a lot of the Sinclair products were. And it was Z80 based. And because of that, even though it was an incredibly simple computer with a membrane keyboard and used a cassette drive, there wasn't a lot to them. But people started making peripherals for them, and you had the ability to expand one of those into what at the time was a decently capable computer. The Z80 machines were the machines that ran CP/M. CP/M being a disk operating system that was popular at the time and used for a lot of business applications. And there's a lot of crazy stories as to how IBM went with Microsoft instead of CP/M, usually involving the owner of CP/M blowing off a meeting with IBM that day, and Bill Gates getting his foot in the door with a product that he didn't even own yet. So crazy stuff. But yeah, all those Z80 machines were, the earlier small business computers, we'll say. And it was neat that a couple of the companies picked that platform for their simple home machines as well. So, and of course, the ZX80 was replaced by the ZX81, which then Sinclair made a deal with Timex to manufacture, and they started selling dozens and hundreds and thousands. And they sold a lot of those computers because I believe they were $99.95, and you could hook it up to your TV and use, I think, any tape recorder with them that had the mic and remote plugs. You didn't have to buy theirs. So interesting stuff. And they did have one at some point. All right. Let me drop. This is W2NDG, Neil, on the Sunday night OMARC Science and Technology Net. Up next, Steve from Poughkeepsie. What's the first computer you remember seeing or using, and the first one you owned?
Hi, Neil. This is KB2TAT. The first computer I ever interacted with, although I never even laid eyes on it, was in the mid-'70s when I was in graduate school. It was an IBM mainframe of some sort. I know we used punch cards, but also as terminals, there were IBM Selectric typewriters, so you could type in input and then just sit back, and the thing would, all of a sudden start typing stuff out for you, which was pretty amazing at the time. First computer I actually got my hands on was an Apple IIe, and I think it was a 48K machine. And then shortly after that, I bought a computer, and that was a Commodore 64, which I absolutely loved. It was a fun little machine. I worked at a place in the mid-'80s where they had an IBM 3090, and then that eventually was replaced by an ES9000, I think it was, a pretty big mainframe at the time. But anyway, that's my computer experience. Back to you, Neil.
All right. W2NDG for ID. A lot of us had that same IBM mainframe exposure. Gee, I wonder why. They were definitely a driving force in this area. Not just in the country in general, as they were, but, it was such a huge fixture in the Hudson Valley. I dealt with some of the mainframes when I got into my medical billing days, and a couple of the offices that we upgraded had smaller versions of that with terminals, all just running some custom designed medical, management practice software that they had gotten. It boggled the mind when I thought about how much this stuff would have cost a doctor at that time. And very few of the offices being computerized. And usually it was cases where the office was somehow associated with a hospital, and there was an advantage to them interfacing with all that. So it was neat stuff. Commodore 64. So that's part of my computer history. Actually, the first computer my family owned was a VIC-20. But we didn't have it very long because the 64 came out, and we managed to convince Dad that that's what he needed to get. And he replaced the 64 with a VIC-20 with the 64. And my brother Paul and I got very proficient with the 64. And even though Paul was 7 years older than me, he went back to college around the time that I went to college. And we shared an apartment in High Falls. And we ran the bulletin board system for the Hudson Valley Commodore Club out of our apartment. We had a separate phone line for it that the club paid for, but we supplied all the hardware, and had a stack of those 1541 floppy drives with all the club's software on it. And I think at the time, a super fast 1200 baud modem. But those were the days. Like I said, I think a lot of us had that same original exposure, though. Next live check-in was Bill, KD2UEN. Bill, so what's your computer history with us? What do you remember seeing first, and what's the first computer you bought?
KD2UEN. Well, Neil, you know what my extensive experiences with computers. Anyway, yeah, first computer I ever saw was my mother worked for the phone company, and they offered her a course as a key punch operator. And I was able to go to the main office of the phone company at the time, Bell, and it was in Newburgh. And they had this big, huge machine there that you fed these cards into, and they were training my mother how to do that job, and she didn't have anybody to pay attention to me that day, and I went into work with her. It was very interesting. I was bored to death, and I got playing with the garbage cans there. And then the first computer I think I ever had, I had bought for my son, my oldest son, and he quickly dismantled it. And that was a Hewlett Packard. It was interesting. I bought him a couple things there, and then I've had other things myself. But I'm interested in an interesting topic tonight. So with that, I'll put it back to you, Neil.
All right, thanks, Bill. And from YouTube, Brad said that his first computer was a Mac 7200. I think it's one of the beige Power Macs. I could be wrong. I had a number of early Macs over the years, and I never owned an Apple II, but spent a lot of time banging on them in school. So Chris looks like he may have gone on the same tour that I did. In the 70s, he said, some IBM mainframe with a plasma display at an open house with some kind of basic game on it. And it looks like the first computer they owned was a Texas Instruments on an old color TV with a cassette program. So that would have been a TI 99 4A. Really interesting personal computer from the early days of home computing. I remember my brother Paul had one for a little while just because he was kind of trying everything and wanted to see what they were like. And the TI was one of those systems that, yeah, you could load programs in on cassette, you could write programs, but it also had a big cartridge slot, and they made games for it. So some of those computers were kind of like having a cross between a game console and a computer. One of the more interesting ones I'll mention in a minute or two. Let's see. He says college brought along the PC Junior with speech, dual 3.5 floppies, and an AT&T 68,000 Linux style on campus. So I remember my computer experiences with college. So I only went to college for 2 years out of high school, and then paused for a little over 30 years, and went back to school and got my degree not very long ago. And yeah, definitely college computing has changed since I first went. So I started at Ulster, and I believe Ulster had an old Burroughs system, I think, at the time. And Chris mentioned a Fortran class, and I took Fortran when I was at Ulster, and it was all on the mainframe. And I know years before that, the computing students would walk around with. Oh, I went over. The Fortran students, but any of the programming students years before we had the mainframes with the terminals, they would walk around with those punch cards, stacks of them with rubber bands around them. And it wasn't very long ago that you could still buy or find punch cards at P&T Surplus. Tim had bought out probably a truckload of what was left when they stopped using them. And for years would use them as note paper at the store. And you would see him writing down phone numbers and notes on punch cards for all those years, blank ones, unpunched. Let me try. I went to New Paltz. New Paltz had also, a mainframe-based system. But in all of those setups, you were starting to see, at least in the computer science departments, personal computers. The high school I went to, Kingston High School, had TRS-80s at first in the computer lab, and then Apple IIs. I took computer programming in my senior year, and we had Apple II Pluses and Apple IIes were just starting to come in. And I already knew how to program. So they would give us a project, a couple of weeks to get it done, and I would bang out the code the first or second day and then spend the rest of the time writing crazy animated introductions to my programs or other silly things that weren't going to affect my grade anyway. The fun part, let me drop. I was also taking calculus at the time, and I kind of put the two courses together for a couple of weeks and did a demonstration where I wrote a little program that graphed parametric equations with varying data input. And what's interesting is the output of it looked like a spirograph. Anybody remember the spirograph? So, and then, of course, the calculus teacher and the computer teacher, who was also a math teacher, tried to explain why that was. And it was kind of cool. It's a way of visualizing math. So all this stuff is neat, but it gives us an idea of how far we've come. And I'll cover that a little more in a minute. This is W2NDG on the OMARC Sunday Night Science and Technology Net. Let's pause and see if there's any more check-ins. If you would like to check into the net, please come with your call sign, your first name, and your location. All right, that's fine. Brad added here in the YouTube chat that, yes, it was one of those early beige Power Macs, and he said it smelled like new ski boots and tires. I tell you, that's probably something that they engineered, because that's the way Apple is. I'm sure they have a department that talks about what their new computers and iPods and now iPhones and iPads smelled like when you opened the box up. So some of the stranger personal computers at the dawn of that industry, and we'll pause for a second to talk about how many companies made personal computers. Let me drop. There were a lot of them. And a lot of these companies have gotten shaken out and disappeared. And, really the same thing happened to the auto industry. If you look back at the dawn of the automobile industry, there were so many automobile manufacturers. And I'm not just talking about, recent memory, manufacturers that have gone away like Studebaker and Packard. There were a lot of car companies. And as time goes on, it all shakes out. Every industry is like that. So early on, certain companies tried to get a piece of the market. The large business computer manufacturers, some of them looked inward and tried to scale down and see if they could capture it. It's funny how long it took IBM to do that, and how long it took them to realize that people wanted something fancier than just text. Apple got the right idea pretty early on. Commodore, extremely successful with their early products, and a company that couldn't keep it together. They fell flat on their face. Yet their final product, the Amiga, was an amazing computer. For those of you science fiction fans, the Amiga with a special card called a video toaster was the way that a lot of the special effects and video sequences were done in the science fiction shows and movies of that age. One of the shows that relied heavily on Amiga technology was Babylon 5. Just interesting stuff. I was an Amiga guy because I'd gone from my Commodore days directly into that. And it was a cool computer. Even the original Amiga 1000, let me drop, had a demo that they used to run when you saw it in a computer store that had 4 programs running simultaneously. The screen was split into 4 quadrants, and it had the computer doing 4 completely different things at the same time. And that was just unheard of at that price point, and really with most computers. The early Macs liked to pretend that they could multitask, but they really couldn't. It was kind of an illusion of multitasking. But there were a lot of strange computers. And another industry that tried to get into this was the gaming industry. Atari had some success with it. With their original computer lines, the 400 XL, the 800 XL, there was a 600 XL in between the two of them. They were a lot like the Commodore 64. They were based on a similar processor. They had a lot of the same peripherals and a lot of the same capabilities. But later on, Atari got into their ST series, which was something they went after Apple with. And they used similar technology to the Macs. And in fact, there are even some lawsuits, and they had to scale back a couple of features because they lost those lawsuits. But they were still interesting computers, and they used a graphical operating system like the Mac OS at the time. And they were quite powerful, and they found a home in the music industry and the desktop publishing industry. And the head of Atari at the time had been somebody who had come out of, I believe, Commodore management. Jack Tramiel, I think his name was. And the industry used to refer to the STs as the Jackintosh because of that. But their slogan was power without the price. And they were pretty popular in certain niche markets, at least. And unfortunately, like so many of the other systems that did have some promise, they lost out to the giant marketing engine that Microsoft was. So, but it was a cool system. Mattel tried to do it. They failed. Mattel produced a computer called the Aquarius. It was never really, I don't know if it wasn't officially sold, or it was and was just for such a short period of time that a lot of people never really saw the official release of the computer. But it ended up somewhere. If we all remember the chain KB, Toy and Hobby, one of the things KB was famous for was buying up lots of, closeout and discontinued things. You can always find really weird toys at KB. Well, one Christmas, they were selling Aquarius computers for some ridiculously cheap price. And I worked at Radio Shack at the time and spent 2 months, 3 months following Christmas that year, all day long, answering the same question. Do you have software for the Aquarius computer? No. Buy a book on basic programming, because that's the only way you're going to get anything on there. But yeah, that was one that didn't make it. A cool one came from Coleco. Coleco came up with the Atom computer. And Atom came in 2 different main flavors. You could buy an Atom all set up, ready to go, which was a computer that also would take a ColecoVision cartridge and play games. Or if you already had a ColecoVision, you could buy the Atom expansion unit, which plugged into your ColecoVision and turned it into an Atom. It was a great concept that just wasn't executed very well. They copied Apple Basic. I don't think illegally. I think they just bought from the same company that originally written Apple's Basic. So you could take a program you'd written in Apple Basic, and if you could just translate that text of the program onto one of the Atom drives and load it in as a computer program on the Atom, it would run right down to the Apple animation shape tables. How do I know this? I did it. I took one of my high school projects when I was working at Montgomery Ward's and typed it in to one of the Atoms they had there, and it worked. Everything worked. The Atom used this crazy high-speed cassette drive. It took what looked like cassettes, but they weren't actually the same thing as cassettes, but they ran at a very high rate of speed. And it was a cheap way of getting a much faster program load and more data on something than the super expensive floppy drives that Commodore and Atari were using at the time. So it was neat. One real oddity, though, and I'll drop. The Atom came with a daisy wheel printer. Great for writing letters. Great for good quality output. So for word processing, probably one of the best computers out there because it came with the printer. It was a stock feature. And there was very few dot matrix printers of those days, which were the cheap ones. And there were very few dot matrix printers that could match that kind of output. So you could, really print professional looking letters. The reason why it came with the printer, and I never really understood this, was because the power supply for the entire computer was in the printer. So you had to turn the printer on to get your Atom up and running. Really strange. But that's the early computers that I remember. And now what do we have? Let me drop. W2NDG on the OMARC Sunday night, Science and Technology Night. Kilobytes. The original Commodore 64. That 64 was a number that referred to the combination, I believe, of RAM and ROM that the computer ran off of. But some of these early systems, like the VIC-20, you were dealing with 4K of RAM. It's hard to think of in those terms today. And then we had computers where we talked about megabytes of RAM. The first PC I built, I think, had 4 megs of RAM. And in order to get the program Doom, famous game that a lot of us played, in order to get Doom to run in 4 megs, you had to hold the shift key down when the computer booted up so that it didn't load any of the extra stuff that took up the RAM. And then gigabytes and now terabytes when we deal with hard drives. 1 terabyte, 2 terabyte hard drives. When we look at solid state drives, 4 terabyte, now 8 spinning drives, 20 terabyte drives. I think we have 40s now. Seems like a lot of data. At work, we're talking about petabytes now. And part of the research community that produces raw data has told my boss and his boss that by the end of the year, they will need 5 petabytes of scratch data storage. That scratch means temporary storage to store raw data before it's processed. Let me drop. By the end of next year, they're estimating 20 petabytes or better. A petabyte is 1,000 terabytes, is 1,000 gigabytes, is 1,000 megabytes, is 1,000 kilobytes. It's hard to imagine that. But when I mentioned before, when we were talking about quantum computing and big data being one of the things that's driving it, this is literally what that is. All right. So, Commodore 64 people. Does anybody know how much data fit on a Commodore 5 1/4 inch floppy, which was what they called the 1541 drive? Does anybody out there know how much data fit on a single-sided Commodore 5 1/4 inch floppy disk?
Was that 180K?
I had Tom and then and Steve underneath him, Steve, what's your guess?
My guess is 128K. For some reason, that number sticks in my head.
Well, you're both close. Tom was closest. It was, I think, 170 and change that fit on one of those 5 1/4 inch Commodore floppies. The original lower density Mac 3.5 inch held 720K. And then, of course, we know that the floppies that we all, got to know through PC computing, and then later on with Apple using a similar format, and devices like the Sony Mavica floppy camera, all using that same format floppy, they held 1.44 megs or 1440K. So how much data do we walk out the door with in the morning? I probably walk out with a little more than most people, but just in your pockets, how much data are you walking around with? It's a great question. Your phone, not counting the program space in an iPhone or an Android phone, holding one up on YouTube here. 64, 128, 256 gigs just in your phone. When I go to work, I have a pocket full of USB drives that probably total about 1.5 terabytes. And it's all sorts of things that I need to do my job. And I have a pocket full of them. I carry 2 cell phones, so it's the storage on those combined. Pocket full of flash drives. And let me drop. If I'm carrying my bag, it has my MacBook Pro in it, which has 1 terabyte of storage in solid state. And sometimes there's also an iPad in the bag. There's also a small canvas pouch in there that has another set of flash media for the things that I don't need quite as often, or blanks that I need to create new flash media to do new things. So all in all, with my bag over my shoulder, everything in my pocket, and my phones and my computers, I'm probably walking around with 4 terabytes of storage on me. And the first floppy disk that I ever used held 170K. It's like Saturday Night Live did the joke commercial about, how much of your cereal would you have to eat to equal 1 bowl of super colon blow? They show like 5 million bowls of cereal. So if you're going to stack up, yeah, the thumb gave out, sorry. If you're going to stack up Commodore 5 1/4 inch floppy disks, somebody could do the math and figure out how many of those you would need to equal how much data I walk out the door with in the morning. So interesting stuff. Don't take it for granted. But like I said, it's heading towards an end, at least to the type of technology that we're currently dealing with. So at some point, we'll run out of the ability to use our current technology, and other technology will supplant that. It's amazing how much they've managed to wring out of spinning media, though. Hard drives, 20 terabytes. Another little crazy thing I'm going to mention for those of you that used a lot of floppies. Let me drop. When zip drives were still kind of expensive, and we had jazz drives, which held 1 gig, which was amazing. CDs held 650 or 700 megs, and we had the early single-sided DVDs, 4 gigabytes. People were trying to fit more on floppies because it was a cheap media. 1.44 was the standard. IBM had a special format they used called, I think, XDF. When you bought OS2, wow, there's a name. OS2 Warp, the ill-fated operating system that it was, but it came on XDF floppies, and I think they held about right around 2 megabytes. A couple companies figured out how to get double density out of the 1.44s, which were already, I guess, technically double density, but they managed to get them up to about 2.88. During the wars between Iomega, SciQuest, and a couple other companies over the zip drive style drives, something really interesting happened. 3M got involved in the fight, and they started a company called Imation, and they came up with a drive called the LS120 drive. The LS120 drive was really interesting because it was backwards compatible with floppies, so you only needed one slot in your computer. So you would put an LS120 drive in your computer, and you could put floppies in it and would read them, and you could put LS120 disks in it, which looked kind of like floppies, but they would hold, I think, slightly more than a zip drive, about 120 odd megs. And they were a lot cheaper than Jazz drives or any of the other larger formats. And they were able to use that 2.88 format, that double format, and get 2.88 megs out of a floppy. Right at the end, when all of this kind of crashed and people just started burning CDs because that all got to be cheap and flash media was starting, Imation replaced the LS120 with the LS240. W2NDG. I never got one. I never got to try one. It just had a very interesting thing that the engineers at 3M had invented. Yes, it was backwards compatible with all of those disks. You could put a regular floppy in it, the special high density floppies, the LS120 drive, the disks would go in it, and the new LS240s, which held 240 megs, as the name implies. But they had figured out a way to format a floppy to hold 20 megs of data. And you have to think of what floppies cost at the time. It was an interesting idea. Unfortunately, because of everything else coming out, it kind of went nowhere. But, 20 megs on a floppy, 20 minutes of music. At the time, that would have been interesting to have, something that cost less than $1 that you could put that much data on. But there's definitely a lot of failed products in the computer industry that we could discuss. You could go on and on. Companies that don't exist anymore, products that went nowhere. There's always going to be a lot of that. And companies that came up with products that didn't have a market and invented the market for the product. That's always fun. So go on forever with that. But we won't, not tonight. So we're going to throw open comment after another round of check-ins. And anything else you want to talk about on this subject or ask more questions, we'll do that. So first, let's see if there's any more check-ins. This is W2NDG on the OMARC Sunday Night Science and Technology Net. Any check-ins, come now with your call sign, your first name, and your location.
AB2KW, Jim, and I'm in Clintondale.
All right, Jim, thanks for checking in. Anybody else? Anybody else? Any more check-ins? All right, Jim, welcome to the OMARC Science and Technology Net. Clintondale, fairly close to where I am. I'm up right off of 299 in Highland. So I don't know if you've been listening much to what we've been talking about. We started talking about quantum technology and then just progress in the computer industry. And I asked everybody what the first computer you ever used or saw was, and what the first computer you owned was. And you're welcome to answer those two questions or come up with another one.
Okay, good evening to the group. Computer that I used in the mid-'80s, I worked at Radio Shack, and we used, I believe it was a Tandy 2000 at the time for daily reports and stuff like that. First computer of my own that I owned was a used 486, I believe it was, that a friend had given me.
That's cool. All right. Let's see. Can I get your call sign one more time? I think I wrote it down wrong.
Sure, it's Alpha Bravo 2 Kilo Whiskey.
All right. Got it. Yeah, I did wrote it down. I definitely wrote it down wrong. I worked at Radio Shack in the early to mid 80s. I went through management training at South Hills Mall. And then I was an assistant manager of the New Paltz store, which was an interesting store because it only had 2 employees, the manager and the assistant manager. And then ended up at Hudson Valley Mall. And then I think I gave notice a day or 2 before the district manager was about to give me my own store. So the rest is history. But yeah, I was very familiar with all the stuff they had. And it was interesting watching Radio Shack evolve and then eventually bow out. So the first PC, after I realized that, the Amigas were not going to continue, I started talking to my brother Paul, who was into PCs, and a couple of friends of mine about building my own. I didn't have a lot of cash to do it, but everybody knew that I wanted to get into this, and people started giving me things. My brother sent me a 286 that he didn't use anymore. It was a pretty big computer, but he sent that off to me. He was living in Wisconsin at the time, and by the time it got to me, it didn't work. But once I found out what was wrong with it, I realized that I wasn't going to be able to use the motherboard or the hard drive, but some of the other parts, including the case. So then another friend of mine gave me 2 megabytes of RAM. And then one of my customers at the time, I was in dental product sales, gave me a 386 motherboard. And I managed to put all of this stuff together, and I made my first computer, a 386 SX25, and put Windows 3.11 on it. But right around that same period, 486s were out at that point. So it was old technology I was working with. All right. So Jim, thanks for checking in, and we'll hit you in the second rotation if you're still around. So back up to the top, Tom, N2 FCC. Anything else you want to ask? Any other comments at the end of the net here?
That's FCC. And the concept of quantum computing is fascinating, like you said. And the leaps and bounds. First ICs, they use like visible light to etch them, and they can only cram so much with visible light, and they went higher frequency UV light, and then that X-rays to etch the integrated circuits to pack the components in. Talking about old computers, and I had the TRS-80, and then I had a couple of Radio Shack color computers. Actually wrote a CW program in BASIC, like a CW practice program. So that was pretty cool. And I still have a Tandy 1000 and a CGA monitor stashed away. Those are my comments for now. Bring back a lot of memories. This is N2FCC back to them.
That's neat. I've gotten rid of most of the trivia at this point. One of the last things I did with that, I had an old compact Presario around. I had a Desk Pro, business machine. It was a 486 or an early Pentium, possibly. But I wanted to see how far I could go with DOS. And it's interesting is when you really start studying and learning and researching about this, how many people continued in that direction, because there are alternative GUIs that run on top of DOS instead of Windows. In fact, FreeDOS, which is still actively developed, comes with a copy of GEM, which was the graphical user interface that ran on the Atari STs. but there were some other ones. There was a guy who wrote a DOS internet browser, and I'm not talking about Lynx for those of you Unix people, because there was probably some DOS versions of Lynx at some point, but this was a graphical browser for DOS. It was called Arachne, and it worked. It was slow, and it knew it was slow. There was some humor in it. Every now and then, if you loaded the page that had enough elements, the browser would put up a message that said, "Rendering your page. Why don't you go make a sandwich?" I thought that was great. But there was a lot you could do with DOS. That was my last, time playing with it. I just wanted to see how much I could actually do. I like doing silly things. W2NDG. I have on one of my Android phones, I have a instance of DOSBox running that'll boot into Windows 3.11 on my Android phone. Yes, it works. I did have XP running in one of the emulators at one point on one of the phones. So, all right, Jim. Final questions, comments on tonight's subject. That's Jim KD2VAH. Sorry. We may have put Jim to sleep. We can come back to him. Matt, KB2GGF. Any final questions or comments on everything?
Nothing to contribute really, but just enjoying the reminiscing and comments about computing. I would be lying if I said that I had a grip on quantum computing. I have watched a few videos on it and, of course, listened to what you said today, but I'm going to have to research that if I hope to understand it naturally. But enjoyed it very much, and back to that.
Yeah, and to tell you the truth, it's taken me a while to get to the point of understanding I'm at now, and I'm still not comfortable with my level of understanding of it. We'll see as time goes on, and I'm sure it's a subject that'll come up where I work, just because of the computational aspect of so much of cancer research and what it's going to do for that field. So good stuff. Steve from Poughkeepsie, KD2TAT. Any final comments or questions?
KD2TAT. Neil, this has been a really interesting discussion tonight. I've really enjoyed it. Brought back a lot of memories, and I'm going to have to check out now. But I just have one final question. Recently, I saw a photo of a quantum computer, or at least a prototype of a quantum computer, and the thing looked like a chandelier, like a 3 or 4 tiered chandelier, and I was just wondering, what about that configuration makes it a quantum computer, or vice versa? Why does a quantum computer need a configuration like that? So anyway, thanks for that, and I'll stand by a couple minutes to hear your answer, and then 7-3, so back to you, Neil.
Well, I'll answer what I think the answer is, but I'm going to throw it out there and see if anybody else knows better than I do. Yeah. And the first thing that popped into my head, for those of you Star Trek original series fans, it's Spock's brain. That's what it is. It's Spock's brain. I would imagine it's because they have to use light to communicate between all of the different modules in a quantum computer, because nothing else would be fast enough. Can anybody verify that? Let me throw it out there.
Way too oriented.
Oh, Jerry, and a late check-in.
I'm going to hazard a guess here, but I think it's to do with the cooling. Like you'd see layered Peltier cooling devices to reach a lower temperature. I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect it's probably multiple layered cooling. I mean, we're talking down near absolute zero.
Yes, and that's one of the things that when I was reading earlier didn't come up. But one of the biggest physical problems with quantum computing is it's very difficult to keep subatomic matter in that state. And it does require supercooling and other trickery. So yes, it's interesting, because I just asked Google the question, why does a quantum computer look like a chandelier? And it's one of the first results from Engadget. It says, from afar, it looks like a steampunk chandelier. And there's a picture, yeah. And they don't really get into the explanation, and I don't want to sit here and read an entire article. But I think Jerry is correct that it has more to do with the cooling, because it has to be pretty close to absolute zero to do what it needs to do. So, great question, though. And Steve, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and glad you found the net. So, I know I think last week was your first time on. And when Jim comes back, it's going to get interesting, because we have a series on radio that I'm going to be doing. So, cool. Next live check-in, Bill, KD2UEN. Any final comments or questions? And we might have put a Bill to sleep as well. I'm sorry, guys. We do get into it pretty far sometimes. But all right. And I'll give a heads up to the YouTube people. If they have any final questions or comments, they can type them into the chat. Jim from Clintondale, and welcome to the net again. I know we just spoke with you, but do you have anything else you'd like to say tonight before we close things out?
No, nothing to contribute, but really enjoyed following along. Started listening to you on YouTube there, and decided to come and turn on the radio. So anyway, yeah, interesting, very interesting, and thank you for running the net.
No, you're welcome, Jim. And we do enjoy doing it. A couple YouTube comments here coming in. Chris says he's still awake because of the quality content. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. And I'm still awake because of the paint fumes. And he knows what I'm talking about. Brad says, yes, the design allows for cryogenic fluid transfer and circulation efficiency. He's going to post a link. All right, cool. Neat. And final would be Jerry. Jerry, I guess you've been listening. Do you have any comments or questions you want to throw out before I end the formal part of the net here?
Okay. First computer, I think, was an IBM Model 30. That doesn't sound right. Do you remember it had a black, I think it had a black cover. Of course, with the bouncing golf ball typewriter terminal. I think it was a 3215. Yeah, I got to play with that a little bit, actually. It was part of the basic school when I got hired at IBM. First personal machine was something called the Micro Ace, which was an American kit version of the Timex Sinclair, the X80. That was fun. And yes, also went through CT
ATM, 0K20 board, to the Amiga. Yay, Amiga 2000. Broke my heart when Commodore imploded because corporate management didn't give a damn. Yeah, so off to Linux then. Whatever. Back to that.
Well, thanks. No, good stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of heartbroken Amiga people out there. And then, of course, our hearts got broken again when the B operating system went nowhere. Or decided they were more interested in legal action than actually producing a product. There's other stuff that kind of salutes the Amiga. It would have been interesting to see where that would have ended up if they had continued developing it. I think eventually it would have been something running on top of something Unix-based, but who knows? But definitely interesting. Let's just see if KD2VAH or KD2UEN are still there. And if not, we'll take last-minute check-ins and we'll close up the net. Jim or Bill, are you still there?
KD2VH is still here.
All right, Jim. We were just looking for any final comments or questions on everything tonight.
Well, this is neither a comment or a question, but in '93 when I bought this house, I drove the phone company crazy because they had to put 16 phone lines in because at the time I was running a bulletin board service. So when I moved into this office, which is now my ham shack, I had 18 computers, 15 for online, one for the internet, and the other two were basically to keep up with the other ones or when they went down. And I ran that from 93 to 97, maybe, 98. But anyway, the phone company got back at me because that poor guy, back then there was 2 lines on every pole because they figured you might want a house line and a fax line or a home business line. Well, anyway, he had to drag every extra line from every telephone pole in this neighborhood to give me all those phone lines. Anyway, those were good days back then. Anyway, it's interesting net tonight.
All right, Jim, I have a question for you. Bulletin boards always had names. Of course, my brother and I ran the HVCC BBS, and we were very fond of a New Jersey BBS called HAL 9000 back then. We used to log into a lot. What was the name of yours?
The network. And I remember HAL. There was HALNet up here. But up here at the time, I was the biggest bulletin board, north of Westchester. Down in Westchester, there was a bigger one. He might have had 16, 17 lines too. I had 15 incoming lines. Basically, one business line with rollovers. I had 250. I believe at the max, I had 275 members.
That's cool, and I think I remember you. Paul and I were really into bulletin boards at the time, pre-internet stuff, and we were always looking. There was a friend of ours ran Spectrum 007 out of, I think, Port Ewan, and that was a multi-node system running on a Radio Shack color computer running OS 9 multitasking. And I think he had a 2 or 3 node system. There was a guy named Drew, I think, in Poughkeepsie that ran a multi-node. There were a bunch of them. But the HAL system, what was neat about it is that it ran on a Commodore 64, but he had written the software, the guy who wrote it, to make it look like you were on something else, because the Commodore bulletin boards typically were a 40-column terminal, but he had written it to mimic an 80-column terminal, and it behaved much like a PC-based BBS. But for those of you who aren't into bulletin boards, bore the heck out of you here. we won't go in that direction. So how about last minute check-in? Is there anybody else who just like to slip in before I close things up here? Give me your call sign, your name, and your location. Great. Well, that's fine. We're going to close out the official part of the net here. This has been the OMARC Sunday Night Science and Technology Net, hosted by the Overlook Mountain Amateur Radio Club. The Overlook Mountain Amateur Radio Club runs this repeater, the 805 repeater, out of the mountain on Woodstock, New York, and we hold 4 nets during the week on this repeater. There are 2 daily nets. We start out the morning at 8:35 with the 835 on the 805, hosted by Paul, AC2UQ, as well as Rob, W2RWS, and Jed, who I always forget the call sign for. I'm sorry, Jed. 6:30 every day, we have the 6:30 check-in net, net that kind of started up around the COVID time, and similar to the 835 net, but slightly more formal. The 835 is not a directed net. It's a roundtable net, whereas the 630 net is an actual directed net, but they're both very casual, and we're basically wanting to know how you're doing, what you're up to. Do you have any questions? Do you have anything you need? Are you having any problems? Because at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of us did need to communicate and need some help here and there. We've continued this, and we've become a very, very active ham community through these nets. Let me drop. Every Thursday night, our club president, Dave K2JLV, hosts the Thursday night Tech Net. Dave usually picks a topic ham radio related, but not always ham radio related, but almost always technical. However, on the first round of check-ins, he does ask anybody if they have anything that they're having issues with or want to talk about. And sometimes that will drive the net. This past Thursday, we had a check-in that asked a fantastic question. A new ham wanted to know how each of us got interested in, attracted to, and finally became ham radio operators. And I thought it was a fantastic question, and it prompted a great discussion. But those are the 4 nets that happen on here. You do not need to be a member of the Overlook Mountain Amateur Radio Club to participate in any of the nets. However, we encourage you to. Meetings are still virtual. We are a very friendly club, very active, and we probably have one of the better field day events around. But check us out if you're not a member. And you can find us at omarcclub.org. omarcclub.org. The 835 net also has its own webpage, by the way, which is 835 on the 805.net. This has been Neil, W2NDG, on the Sunday night OMARC Science and Technology Net. Closing the net. I will stay for a few minutes like I always do if anybody wants to chat, but I'll be ending the YouTube feed now. Thanks to all who checked in, and thanks to all who participated. Have a good night.